ultimately you would in fact have a group of citizens themselves at that planetary level looking at what is really important based not on what one power block says, but what actually people want from around the world. This is one of these areas where something really has to unravel before we'll put this in place. I'm not suggesting this is going to happen 5 or 10 years from now, but what I am suggesting is that the initial notions for this around citizens' assemblies, we can put our time and energy and investment in, and we are going to see this system unravel. It's terrifying, it's tragic. I don't want it. None of us who care about any kind of avoidance of suffering wants what we see happening, but it is happening. And we are going to find people asking more and more, we've got to reorganize the world in a different way.
Jeremy Lent, welcome to the Accidental Gods podcast. How are you and where are you on this amazing equinox day?
Well, I'm doing, you know what they always say nowadays, doing fine considering. It's a beautiful, it's like a heat
Especially
wave
in the
here.
US. Right.
Yeah, once an historical hot through to climate breakdown heat wave in the west, but here in Berkeley, the weather's just balmy and really sunny and lovely. And, I guess just being focused so much on what is possible, somehow the world unraveling is, I'm not taking it in with quite as much horror as sometimes I go, maybe I should be because things are really bad right now. But it also, I think, is so valuable to just look at what's actually possible and just know all the energies that are around there to really forge something in place of what's going on.
Yes. And to honor the people who are doing amazing things, I noticed this morning that the Kennedy Center had given an award to the people of the Twin Cities in
Mm,
Minnesota for their courage in the face of what they very kindly called federal overreach. And and I thought that act in itself showed tremendous courage. And of course, the people who came out in their tens of thousands with their 3D printed whistles to say, no, you're not doing this, were all showing astonishing courage. And it gives me great hope that
mm.
as the old system, what you call in the book Wendigo Inc., is very obviously falling apart, that decent people are stepping up and not going the way of everybody said. If we all asked, how did Germany end up where it was, why did people do nothing? And people are not doing nothing, and I am in awe of those people and hope that as and when fascism comes to the UK, that we will all have similar courage.
Mm.
So thank you to the people of Minneapolis, Minnesota, Twin Cities, and also to the Kennedy Center for ignoring the fact that they've been renamed the Trump Kennedy Center and giving out an award that he probably won't find very pleasing. Anyway, leaving that aside, you and I talked shortly after the No Kings parades, which were another step forward with people into at least laying a boundary of this far and no further. And in that time, the world has grown more chaotic. And your book has become, I would say, ever more important because, as Milton Friedman said, when things fall apart, the ideas that are lying around are the ones that will get picked up. And you're offering us a whole bunch of ideas. So last time we talked about Tina, There Is No Alternative, and Wendigo Inc., which is the egregore, the Moloch, the, what is it, Nate Higgins calls it, the superorganism, um,
Right.
and why it existed and why it was always inevitably, at some point, going to get to where it's got now. And that's only really the first quarter, third of your book, because the rest is a pulling together of the multi-systemic ideas of how we could have an eco-civilization.
Hmm.
So this podcast, I would like to explore the ideas of eco-civilization. Can
Mm.
you outline for us what the basic principles are of an eco-civilization? And then we can begin to unpick how
Yeah.
we get there.
Yeah, no, I'd love to do that. And the basic, well, there's a core basic principle, which is so simple. Pretty much anybody, I think, in the world would kind of agree with it. It makes so much sense to simply imagine what a system would look like if it set the conditions for all beings to thrive on a regenerated Earth. Which I imagine if you're not a psychopath or a sociopath, probably anyone else in the world would say, well, of course the system should be built on that kind of thing. And of course, we know the system is built on totally different principles, extraction, exploitation, the wealth pump, the whole thing. And if you could go sort of one level beyond that core foundation, and say, well, what does that mean? What are the sort of principles that are different if you sort of go to that next level? And there are sort of things like our dominant system is based on human supremacy, the sense that humans are somehow uniquely different from all the rest of life on Earth, and we have a moral right to do whatever we want to mistreat animals, destroy ecosystems. So an eco-civilization fundamentally different, based on a sense of the intrinsic value of all life. And and that human supremacy, that sense of extraction exploitation leads to the idea of the dominion of capital. We live in a world where it's considered okay for capital, basically, and its needs to replicate itself, reproduce nonstop, that is considered to be the core of the system, and that's all right. So instead, imagine a system where the dignity of all people has primacy rather than the dignity of capital. And it sort of goes on like that, rather than commoditization and homogenization based on heterogeneity and diversity, and rather than hierarchies. There's this core concept of subsidiarity, which is pushing power to the lowest level in the system, to the grassroots. So instead of structural inequality and the whole system designed for that wealth pump, you design it for equity. It's not saying exact equality, right? But equity, this a sense of fairness, a sense that no matter where you're born in the world, you have an equal opportunity, equal rights to try to flourish in your particular way in the world. And instead of incentives for selfish behavior, like if you're basically in this system, if you're selfish, basically a true asshole, that is actually considered okay, and you get rewarded for that. So imagine a system where it was designed for cooperation, where basically acting according to our core human evolved sense of what's fair and right. And imagine if you actually got the rewards for doing that rather than that being working against the system. Those are sort of the fundamental premises, and those things can apply to every aspect of our global civilization, whether it's economics or wealth structuring or technology or urban design or governance or law. And really what the book does is looks at each of those areas and looks at people who have actually done the work to figure out how a system could look like if it were based on those kinds of principles.
Yeah. Yeah, which is absolutely utopian because a lot of people, exactly as you say, are doing their own bits, but very few people are doing the actually extraordinarily hard work of knitting them all together. And it's the knitting them together that produces a unified theory of change that then, for me anyway, stacks up much more strongly because people can pick apart, let's say, we want to change the food and farming system. And there's a shit ton of yes buts that arrive of yes, but you can't do that because, and they're all linked into because the rest of the system is carrying on as before. And this is perfectly true. We can't change just one part within the system. We're going to have to change the entire system. And the only good thing we can say about the current leader of the free world and his minions is that they are actually taking a sledgehammer to the system. And if Bernie Sanders or someone like him had somehow become president and had even looked at the sledgehammer, there would have been a military coup by the afternoon. And somehow Trump is getting away with just destroying the entire post-war agreements. And everybody's going, that's not very clever, but nobody's stopping him. So given that, as we said, the ideas that are lying around are the ones that will be picked up. And given that we are in capitalism and it is easier to imagine the extinction of all life on Earth than it is to imagine the end of capitalism. And it is the flow of capital and the accumulation of capital and the structures of capital and the markets and vigilante bond markets stopping governments from actually doing what they're intended to do, which is spend money. I think it's worth first looking at how we could change the economic part of the system in the understanding of ourselves and people listening that none of this is being done in isolation. The plan is never to do that. The plan is somehow, and I would like to get to this before the end of the podcast, doing it all at the same time in a world where we're not just foraging for food in the rubble of the last civilization, which would not be fun. So, in your book, you break the grip of capitalism into economics and wealth and finance, which begins to make it slightly easier. So each of those could be a separate podcast on their own. Each of them could be an entire podcast series on their own. So we're only going to skim across the surface, but with a surface skim, how do we change the ways that we share and account for and accumulate value?
Mm. Yeah, thanks. And yeah, this is a core part of it. And I love your focus on the fact that all these things, the weave has to come together. And so that's really important to remember whenever we're talking about each of these things, that it's very easy and natural to say, well, that wouldn't work because of this and that. And so we have to think of all this becoming a different coherent system with a different weave. But to get to that really great place to begin, um, really at a very high level, I'll take a look at the sort of headlines for each of those, the economics and finance and wealth distribution, if you will. And with economics, really the simple place to begin is looking at what are the fundamental driver behind economic theory and what people focus on today is this notion of GDP, gross domestic product, being somehow like a measure of prosperity. And the success of a politician or a country is based on, well, how well are they growing the GDP? Is it more than 3% a year? That's good. Or if it's going negative, heaven forbid, it's a recession. And that one of the fundamental things to get it is that that is absolutely the wrong measurement. What GDP actually measures is essentially the rate at which the system is sucking living forces of the living earth and human behavior into the monetized economy. That's simply all it measures. So if you have an oil spill, that's great for GDP because then you have to clean it up. And then if people get really sick from it, even better for the GDP because then they have to be hospitalized. And that's part of the. So it's like everything that is, whatever is good or bad, is good for GDP. But if you grow your own vegetables in the garden, that's a disaster for GDP. And if you give them away to your friends, even worse, because you should be selling them. So it's completely backwards in terms of what it measures. So, an alternative framework is one that I bet many people here on this podcast know well, is Kate Raworth's Doughnut Economics, which is a brilliant and like a whole different paradigm of thinking about economics. And one of my chapters is called Living Within the Donut. And very simply, the donut measures the outer elements of the donut are basically all the different layer, the different measurements of what would be required for sustainably living on the earth. And of course, we've blown through most of those, whether it's climate, atmosphere, uh, pollution, you name it. So we have to live within the donut on that side. But the donut has an inner ring. And the inner ring are basically what are the things that would set the conditions, the material conditions for people to basically have a normal life. Basic access to food, healthcare, housing, security, education. So what are the basics you need? And her point is, and that's it's been measured and quantified. Like, what we need to do is live within the donut. And when you look at the measurements, there's not a single country in the world that actually lives within the donut. Global North countries have totally broken through the boundaries on the outer, even if some of the inner are somewhat acceptable. And most countries in the global South don't even come close to meeting the inner, and some of them are even breaking through on the outer.
Can I ask a question that this goes beyond the book, but this is something I think about a lot, and you think about it a lot, so I don't often get a chance to ask people. And I am enamored of Kate's work, and I think she should get the Nobel Prize for Economics. I want to lay that on the ground first. I think it's brilliant. It creates a completely different model. That said, the model is still predicated on old paradigm thinking, as far as I can tell, and we need to widen the boundaries quite a lot. The planetary boundaries, which are currently the measure of the outside, the Stockholm Institute named 9 of them, one of which was the ozone layer. And actually, the ozone layer is one of those things that was complicated but not complex. And once we stop producing ozone, it's closing. So that isn't actually ever going to be breached unless somebody starts pumping refrigerants into the atmosphere for the fun of it, but let's assume not. That leaves 8, of which we have blown through all. So we need I would say some more nuanced measures of the outer boundary. The inner boundary is the one that I find really fascinating. If we are aiming for a future in which all sentient beings can flourish, can have lives of meaning and purpose, where they have agency and freedom to move, and they haven't just got Maslow's hierarchy of needs, but they've got all of what we currently consider to be essential to a life well lived, then that inner boundary, I would suggest, needs to be predicated on different values. And so, for instance, education being available to all children, we'd have to define the nature of education, because at the moment, I don't know what it's like in the US, but in the UK, most schools are still teaching on a 19th century model that produces kids fit to serve either to manage or work in factories. And this is not the future that we are offering to them. We also would need concepts. Jobs are a product of capitalism. Indigenous cultures and communities don't have jobs. They just live together in community, and the community flourishes and produces joy and wonder, and in passing, there's food to eat. I did hear a podcast the other day. It was Your Undivided Attention, Asa Raskin, saying, and I have not followed this up, that somebody found an uncontacted tribe in the Amazon and gave them all Starlink phones. And within a month, they were starving because the hunters were all hunched over their phones. And this proves that it's not our culture that's bad, it's the phones that are bad. And that exploded so many parts of my brain, and it was splattering off the ceiling. And I still can't believe that somebody would do that thing. But the concept that that's a good thing, that needs to be eradicated as part of our baseline. And we need to be looking at what is it that allows human flourishing. And I think it's more complex. I think Kate did a very good job of taking what we currently consider within the UN and sustainability goals and all the rest of it to be human flourishing. But I'm really interested in if you were redesigning the inner ring of the donut, the floor through which we must not step, have you any ideas of what would be there? I understand that I haven't asked you this before, and it may be that this is just too complex and here is not the time, but I'm curious just to see where you take it.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And that's, I mean, in a way, this is why the book looks at every aspect of what we call our world system, what is known as civilization, whether we agree with that word or not. But so in a way, Kate Raworth's Doughnut Economics is one aspect of what maybe 10 or 12 different dimensions of what we're looking at. And appropriately, as an economics, it does look at material conditions, more than some of these other things. So a lot of what I look at actually is education is a great example. Other examples, like law or finance, actually. And in many of these examples, what we find is that things we take for granted as just sort of the way it is actually the product, just like capitalism, just like so many other things, the product of this weird, really weird way of thinking that arose in early modern Europe around the 17th century, and in the state of education is more like the 18th, 19th centuries. But these are things that are absolutely against what is required for true human flourishing. So education, to your point exactly, the very notion we have of kids, in geometric room, sitting at a desk with total surveillance, being looked at by this great authority, the teacher at the very top, telling them what they need to think, sort of conditioning ways of thinking in them. If they want to go to their bathroom, to put their hand up and be allowed out. Like, it's the actual structure of this was not in order to allow children to learn how to flourish. It was basically designed by Bismarck's state of like militarized Prussia, to actually turn the whole population into military machines. So it was like it was designed, and it was actually there was a quote from one of the sort of philosophers helping to design it, that all we've got to do is basically destroy the sense of free will of the children and turn them into people who like accept love of their nation, love of their country, love of of what is good, which is determined by the authority that tells them. So our entire system is designed not for to create people to question, grow, flourish, but quite the opposite. And it's done a great job of that. And of course, market capitalism took the idea of that militarized state and then transformed it into inculcating basically consumerist ideas and the ideas of if you want to be successful, you got to get really good at tech so you can get status in the world. So education is one of these things that actually has been totally rethought in different ways. And somebody called Manish Jain and many others developing a whole network group of real rethinkers. They call themselves eco-versatives around the world, really focusing on this idea of unlearning the conditioning that society puts into people. And it turns out that if you actually set the conditions for just little kids to create their own education, to do what they want and go where their interests are, if you do that skillfully over years, they actually end up not just being much more fulfilled human beings, but they love the idea of education. And they end up wanting, once they discover this is the way the world works, you got to like pass exams to get, they end up doing better on exams, being more successful at college, being more self-directed because they've been developed in their own way. That's just one example of so many. When you look at our systems that we just take for granted, you find that they didn't just arise in some evolved way. They rose for as part of this authority, this kind of wealth pump concept that is going through and through.
Right. Thank you. Yes. Yes. Daniel Schmachtenberger was home educated, which always is my core example of home education is a good thing if you do it right. Okay, so we I think we're definitely agreed that we want a ceiling beyond which we don't break and a floor beyond which we don't sink within an economy that is predicated on flourishing of the ecosphere rather than extraction from, pollution of, destruction of. How then does finance and wealth accumulation fit in?
Right, exactly. I'm glad we went back to that original trio, which really works well together. So, well, finance is another one of these, really just like education. Um, it seems so complicated, and we just kind of take for granted somehow money just appears, and that's the way it is. And then you do a little bit of delving into it, and you discover, oh, the way money works is banks create money because they create debts, and the government somehow tells them to do that or changes interest rates if they want more money. And that's how money works. Well, it turns out it's not just how money works, it's how it developed to work within this monetized system. And basically, it's this whole notion of debt-based money is something that simply began actually in England
Mm.
when the king a few hundred years ago needed to get a loan to finance his military, but all the different wealthy merchants of the time had been, yeah, they basically had not
They've
gotten their
been
money
bled
back from
dry,
us.
basically.
They said, well, I'll tell you what, we'll loan you money, but we're not going to loan it to you, king. We're going to loan it to the country, and everyone, the whole country has to pay us back. Well, that was the beginning of debt-based money. That was the beginning of the Bank of England. And ever since then, basically, you got the way money is created is by the banks, like privately owned, shareholder owned entities, are given the power to actually just create money out of the blue. Basically, it's called fiat money, which is basically like the first sentence in Genesis, and God created the earth. This word is because that's how money gets created. They just
Yeah,
decide we're
they
going to
just
do
make
it,
it up.
but it's done through debt, and they decide where to send that money based on where they can make the most money. So the entire system of money creation is structurally designed to create debt, which then has to be paid back in an interest rate, which is why you have to have a growth-based GDP growth economy just to keep the thing stable. It's like a game of musical chairs where they keep taking a chair away. So and no one wants to be the one to default. So everyone's got to fight harder to make sure they're the one on the next chair. It's a designed system to get everyone at each other's throats to beat the other one so they're not the ones who go down with because they can't pay the debt.
Yeah.
That's the way it does. It doesn't have to be anything like that. There are serious-minded, sober economists and financiers for the last 100 years that have basically said, what looked at what would happen if the state democratically decides to create money by putting it into where it's needed the most. So the state can choose to give money basically as a universal basic income to everybody, or it can decide to put money into some institution.
Hospitals.
This well, hospitals exactly, or an area that has really been is going through very economically hard times. It can choose to put money into a whole department to restructure that area. It can choose to do that. The only thing stopping it is the system that has institutionalized this basic element of capitalism. So this is one example of like once you look at this, it's like are you living in Alice in Wonderland? No, this is actually the world we live in.
Yeah.
And at first, when I was discovering this, I was going, well, maybe I'm reading some radical polemicist. Let me read another researcher on this. Let me read another one. And I started to realize that all the people who have looked at this are saying the same thing. So, and that's a big part of what this book's about is not to try to put harebrained ideas out that some brilliant genius might have come up with, but others don't agree with. These are solid ideas that are based on real thought.
Yeah.
So that's kind of finance, if you will, just at the top level. But then wealth distribution, I mean, even more amazing when you think about it. So there's this kind of myth that goes on in the world today, like that basically maybe some people agree that if you're an inherited billionaire or something, it's kind of not fair. You're a Nepo baby, whatever it might be. But people say, well, at least, the most, if the billionaires are self-made and they're entrepreneurs, they kind of deserve it. Look what they've done. And they've really made all of us, given something to all of
Do you know
us.
anyone who actually says this anymore?
Well, I don't know personally some of these people because I tend to be in a particular place, but I think that this is the
The
mainstream
narrative is still
way
there.
of thinking, and this is why it's allowed, and this is why we don't see a popular movement to say we've got to do something about this. But these are the ideas that this book looks at. If you actually look at the wealth, and there's this massive wealth in the world today, material wealth. And we recognize that a lot of this wealth has been created at the extraction from nature and from the living earth, and that's something we can then explore maybe in a few minutes. But the fact is, we live in a time of unprecedented material wealth in the world for human beings. But the thing is, 99% or whatever, the vast amount of that wealth does not by right belong to any one person. It's an accumulation of wealth over the millennia. It's wealth that first happened when people first developed basic technologies and when people learned about farming and developed seed resources. And it's wealth that was really the moral right to all of us. And then it's when people discovered electricity, and then more recently, things like the internet, or all of these things. That doesn't belong to one person. It's something that a simple fact of being born into this earth today gives each person an equivalent right to I call in the book and what other people have called the Commonwealth. So take that idea, that ridiculous colonial English idea of the Commonwealth, actually use those words how they're meant to be, and there is a Commonwealth, and that is available, should be available to all of us. Instead, Mark Zuckerberg comes along, does a few tweaks to the tiniest little 0.1% of all that Commonwealth that allowed him to be in this place, creates something called Facebook, copyrights it, and now he's worth like whatever, $350 billion, when basically almost half the world is not able to even earn enough money to ensure that they have enough nutrition for a long and healthy life. Now, that to me is the most extreme moral egregiousness of this system. And the once you start from that foundation, you lead to very different ways of thinking about wealth distribution. You can look at things like universal basic income, which we've both talked at other times about. There's challenges about in this current system, a universal basic income just applied could backfire and all kinds of weird things would happen. But if you consider it not even as a universal basic income, but a universal common dividend that is available and should be available and should be given by some trust to every person by virtue of just being born into as a human being on this earth. And that would fundamentally change essentially every aspect of our of our economy and how the world works. It doesn't mean that you can't have people enjoying wealth from something that they have done that is very meaningful and valuable to people, but there would most definitely be a cap on that wealth. And there's somebody called Ingrid Robbins who's written a really great book recently, what she calls limitarianism, which is really laying out the very clear and simple philosophical foundations for exactly that, establishing that kind of cap on wealth.
Oh, I want to talk to her because Plato suggested that there should be a limit of 20 to 1 on the highest paid to the lowest paid. And that seems to me, if you're going to have, I think there shouldn't be pay. I think money shouldn't exist. I think, we should be moving into a post financialized world, in which case all of this is hypothetical. But on the way there, we definitely need caps.
Yeah,
The
absolutely. Yeah.
The argument against them seems to be so. Richard Murphy is a modern monetary theorist in the UK. And modern monetary theory is the one that says governments make the money and they have
Hmm.
a duty to make it and spend it. And the vigilante bond markets should not be allowed to stop us.
Hmm.
He had quite an interesting conversation with Zach Polanski because one of the things that's happened since you started writing this book is that Zoran Mamdani in the US and Zach Polanski in the UK have come along and are
Hmm.
making very clear, new or new to the legacy media commentariat ideas that taxing wealth is absolutely essential and useful and good. And it's really hard to argue against it. Richard says you won't be able to tax the billionaires because they'll just move their money away, which I find it interesting because he's a modern monetary theorist. He definitely knows that it would be a good thing. His book was called The Joy of Tax. He just says you won't get it because they have the capacity to slide it away. And I'm thinking, most of the tax havens, the British Virgin Islands or whatever, Panama, are actually British protectorates. And anywhere else is probably under the sway of the US or has been until very recently. It should not, I would have said, be impossible to tax the billionaires, to make sure that they cannot move their
Hmm.
money offshore. And if they do, then you start taxing assets. And if they move everything into cryptocurrencies, which seems to be stablecoin, seems to be at the moment the potential shift of choice because they can see that the dollar is no longer going to be a fiat currency, then we have to find a way to tax that. And I wonder, is that something that you're thinking about or that you're seeing
Hmm.
in
Yeah.
the groups that you're in?
Yeah, and you raise a lot of really important topics there. So let me kind of unpack a few of them. I mean, one is there is this argument, of course, that everyone uses all the time. The billionaires will just move out. In California, we're looking at the legislation for a one-time wealth tax, and that's the argument people use. It's the argument people have used in New York with Mamdani and all this stuff. Well, actually, practically speaking, just so you know, it turns out that doesn't really happen
It
very
doesn't
much.
happen. Yeah.
That in practical terms, people don't want to move out of where they, of course, if you're a billionaire and you spend your life in your super yacht, that's one thing. But for most people, they actually want to live in the area where their family is, and they're not going to do that anyway. But the point is, if they were to do that, if that's the risk, it points to what is needed is basically common collaborative approaches to these things. This
Yeah.
is part of the reason why our system has devolved in such a terrible way, because it's almost like this notion of the race to the bottom.
Hmm.
Um, and you see this in the US, for example, where Delaware gave the best laws for corporations to basically extract and exploit for maximum shareholder value. Other states were more constrained. You shouldn't. So of course, every corporation goes and then
Has its head
incorporates
offices
in
in Delaware.
Delaware. Simple. Um, and you get the same race to the bottom in globalization with countries. One country tries to protect its workers and says we've got to have a minimum wage so they don't like end up working 18 hours a day and still live on starvation wages. Another country says, hey, we've just been taken over by another neoliberal autocrat. Welcome corporations. Where are the corporations going to go? To the country that allows them to do whatever they want. So that's what we've seen with decades of globalization. But the same thing applies to things like wealth tax. And the thing that is hopeful is that they're actually, over the last 10 or 20 years, the G8, like the most powerful countries economically in the world, came together with a similar kind of issue to tax corporations. I mean, one of the biggest basically frauds that goes on in the world today is global corporations hide the vast bulk of the profits they make in every country through basically illegal transfer pricing, where they pretend the pricing is different. So in countries where they would be taxed high, their subsidiary, oh, lo and behold, it doesn't make any
Doesn't
money,
make a profit.
but and ends up all the money seems to get made in this one
In
tax haven,
Luxembourg.
right?
Yeah,
Exactly.
yeah,
But the G8, I think it was the G8, might have been the G20, but I think it was the G8, came together and said, we're going to apply a tax rate across the board so that corporations can't do that. And it
wow,
worked. And actually, the amount of remuneration that countries get from taxation on corporations now has increased as a result of that. So there is work going on around trying to get a general consensus about applying a wealth tax among different countries to avoid some of those problems. But this does come again and again to this core issue that it's a little bit like this notion of the prisoner's dilemma, that it's only through working cooperatively that with different nation states and different groups
yeah,
agreeing that there is a greater good we have to work for, that a lot of these ideas will come about. So I think it's a very, very key point that it can be done, but I think it can only be done by setting a different moral foundation.
yes,
And that's why this is why it's this so core in this book to realize this is not about like one country saying, well, we shouldn't do that because people deserve the all the riches they have, and if they're poor, it's because they didn't work hard enough. All this kind of stuff. We got to set a different moral foundation, like this notion of the Commonwealth, and from that, a whole different array of solutions or next steps begin to apply.
yes, yes. So, oh, this is veering off the book slightly, but I'm bringing together a number of things that you just said and that I've heard elsewhere. So, we need a new moral foundation. Actually, in the book, you go quite well through the ISDS, the Investor States Dispute Settlement. And it seems to me this is a thing for people who haven't yet listened to our last episode. It's a particularly egregious global setup that basically everybody seems to have been forced to sign into at the point of a threat of something bad that's probably already happened. That basically means that a company can sue a country, not just for if the country makes any, suppose the country passes a law that says no more fossil fuels, then the fossil fuel companies can sue them, not just for loss of current income, but for loss of projected income, which would absolutely bankrupt most countries if they are going with the bizarre idea that they need to take money in as tax in order to spend it. And I say this often enough on the podcast, that's not how money works. When you take money in as tax, you destroy it. No government needs to take in tax. They make the money. But what they do need is for the bond markets not to crash their economy, because the bond markets want the tax take and the government spend to be somewhat in the same order of magnitude. But it seems to me that if companies can set up an ISDS, which is global, then they could also set up everybody's going to pay fair tax. And for me, that would mean there's a ceiling of here's your profit limit of, let's say, 999 million, and after that, everything is taxed. But to get to that, we would have to have a complete change in values. And I was listening to Bold Politics with Zach Polanski, and he was talking to Kino West, I think, who's a social scientist, who's done a very interesting experiment where they offer a variety of people, we're going to give you a £10 note and you have to share it with this other person that we will describe to you. And you either have to share it 50-50, you get £5 each, or you can have £3 and the other person has £1. Those are your only options. And here are the people that you're sharing with, make your choice. And there are a number of people who, when given that option, will have the £3, so they will make themselves poorer in order that the other person only has the £1. And they will particularly do that if the other person is not the same skin, well, basically not white, because it's white people who tend to do this, or they're a man and the other person is a woman, or they perceive the other person to be an out group that they don't like. And And I want to explore this more because my basic feeling of life is that offered that everybody would go, well, 50-50, that's obvious. But there must be a significant number of people who will do the 3-to-1, which makes a lot more sense of MAGA in the US and reform in the UK, and makes it a lot harder then for us to shift the value set towards empathy and compassion and mutual flourishing. And I have no idea how we would begin to shift the dial on that, other than 80% of the population is living in empathy and compassion and mutual flourishing, and the 20% who would give you £1 so they could have £3 and the other £7 vanishes, see it and realize that it's much, much better. And I'm wondering what you've thought about this probably more deeply than I have. How do we create the social shift that creates the value shift, that creates the energetic shift and the emotional shift that allows the changes that you and I both want to begin to emerge?
Hmm. Yeah. Profound investigation, man. I love this. And well, I think I'd begin with recognizing that what we're not talking about trying to do is kind of shifting these people who are acting in that more sort of self-centered or even negative for self or other way. We're not trying to sort of get them, we're not trying to improve them or whatever. What we're really looking at is getting back to a value system that is our evolved human nature. That what we need to recognize is the people who are acting in that sort of destructive way that you just described have only gotten to that place by being conditioned by a society that has brought out all of the most selfish and fear-driven and ego-driven instincts that in there from that kind of education system that we were just describing before, and from the whole system that says you've got to like that your in-group is what you got to fight for, and the out-group are the enemy, and all that stuff, which is designed to deflect people's attention from what is really causing them to be so desperate. And so this is where really the strength and the possibility and the hope for what's possible comes in. That as human beings, we evolved in completely the other way. As human beings, we evolved in nomadic hunter-gatherer bands to actually have a sense of really strong group identity and a sense of what is right and wrong. And, again, we've been trained by biologists like Richard Dawkins ever since the 1970s to believe in the selfish gene and to believe that actually people are selfish. And yeah, Richard Dawkins tries to explain that, yeah, he's not an immoral person, but what his whole thing is to call people to overcome their innate selfishness by trying to be good or whatever. Um, and so this is not, a critique of his morality, but it's a critique of his understanding, which is shown to be absolutely flawed, both about biology itself and in particular about human beings. We actually evolved to be one of the most cooperative species in the world. And among mammals, we're incredibly cooperative, and especially what is almost unique about us is we're super cooperators with those who are not kin. And this is how we evolved in those nomadic hunter-gatherer bands to be successful and as a hominid species to evolve into humanity. So we have emotions like embarrassment or guilt, or we love people that we see being generous and kind. And these are deeply felt emotions, and this is who we are as human beings. But our dominant culture has to basically wipe that out of people from infancy onwards. So it uses whatever, internet and commercials and cereal, like toys and cereals and all this stuff right from the very beginning to try to instill selfishness and greed and status anxiety and stuff in little kids. So they'll grow up into being good consumers of this dominant society. So that's where, once we recognize that, it gives us the sense what we want to do is allow people to reconnect with what is in their hearts deeply already, not try to sort of get to some next level of human species and a greater level of consciousness. It's about reconnecting with our core humanity. Love to get to a level of consciousness, but that might take a while. But the thing is, and this is where There's been like generations of work done on basically what it is that does give these incentives for more pro-social behaviors. Many people will be familiar with the name Eleanor Ostrom, who won the Nobel Prize for Economics, the first woman to do so, after spending decades studying the commons. And the commons basically is really interesting because it's the economic manifestation of that evolved human self-organized sharing that I was just describing. And it's exactly in contrast to the wealth pump and to empire and to the rise of global capitalism in the last 500 years. The commons existed, groups existed all around the world that shared their resources, worked together, not through some leader telling them this is what you've got to do, but through actually a set of self-organized principles, like basically a shared sense of identity, of values, recognizing if somebody started to break some of the guidelines, they'd have what was called ratcheted sanctions. At first, it would just be, hey, you're not meant to do that, guy, and most people would get that. And then if people keep being basically jerks, at some point the whole group says, no, this is not acceptable. Maybe they get ostracized, something extreme. That works, and that leads to stable, very really flourishing groups around the world. What's fascinating is that the evolutionary biologist David Sloan Wilson, he's one of the leading evolutionary biologists in the world today, who came up with this whole sort of say biological theory of sort of co-evolution of different groups. But basically, he worked with Ellen Ostrom, took that work and used it to look at what are the core principles of for pro-social behavior in groups in general, not just in traditional commons. And that's something that, in a way, when you look at ways to organize ourselves for this eco-civilization, that's a foundational set of precepts because that actually brings out the best in human beings. We actually do want, I mean, for that study that you described, there's studies that actually go the other way. And actually, it turns out that most people just at random will want to give to those they don't know. And there's even a sense of wanting to punish people who you see being basically really really aggressive and nasty, even if it hurts yourself. It's called altruistic punishment. And it's part of what we evolved as human beings to do, to look out for the group. So, if you see somebody butting in the queue ahead of you, or ahead of other people, and you're not even in the queue, but you don't like that. And sometimes, you might have the courage to go to hey guy, you're not meant to be doing that, even if it puts you at risk. That's the kind of sense that makes us really caring human beings. But I think that's the kind of instinct that then got hijacked and manipulated to cause exactly what you're describing by inculcating in somebody, you are the in-group, and that's what your morality is based on. Then they're ready to do their own altruistic punishment for themselves to stop that out-group person from getting anything at all because they care so much about their value system. So I think it's a lot of what happens is basically our value system arises ultimately from our sense of identity. And if we're told we're separate individuals and our only identity arises from the in-group, will lead to one value system. If we begin to see ourselves as being part of all of humanity and as humans being part of all life, we'll naturally come up with a very different set of values.
Yes, yes. Even as you're talking, I was remembering John Young telling us that by the age of 12, the average Indigenous youngster has made meaningful relationships with over 400 other species. And these are
Mm.
reciprocal relationships, give and take. And and it's much harder, I would imagine, to consider your in-group to be a small subset of humanity when you know yourself to be an integral part of the web of life in that much, much bigger, orders of magnitude bigger scale than that. Okay, so we're beginning to build a picture of different ways of exchanging, storing, and accounting for money, different ways of educating, different floors and ceilings for how we might want our civilization. And we're going to use that because I think it works as a word, to be honest. Well, although there have been discussions as to
Mhm,
whether it's
mhm.
right, but it covers the basis. There's a lot to cover in the next 10 minutes. We still have to eat. We still have to have clean water, and water seems to me to be one of the commons that certainly in the UK we have failed on very badly. And actually, I think pretty much in the US, Australia, messing up our water has begun to become an issue. And as data centers take more, it's going to become more of an issue. But again, we're at one of those fracture points. If it is likely the case that we cannot get industrial agricultural chemicals because the Straits of Hormuz are closed, it might be the end of industrial agriculture, which I think would be a remarkable thing. I was listening to a podcast earlier today who said that by year 5, people who move to a regenerative agriculture system have 8 times either the yield or the profit, and I can't remember which, and they're not exactly coterminous, but 8 times. And the person who has this data goes around big agricultural conferences, and the industrial agriculture people actually don't believe it because they've been told the narrative that we need industrial
Mhm,
agriculture to feed the 8 billion, and it's not true. But we might
mhm.
be just about to discover that it's not true. So, this is again, it's a whole other podcast because food and health are so intimately intertwined. If we have good, nutritious food, we are much more healthy. And conversely, if we have ultra processed nonsense and toxic water, then we're not going to be healthy, and that's going to cost the health system a lot of money. How, in our evolving concept of a different way of doing things, how do you see us feeding ourselves and each other?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And I have a chapter
You do?
just focusing on agriculture, of course, which is so fundamental. And the first thing to recognize is just what you were saying. Basically, this our entire food system is broken. Is a disaster from beginning to end, from the way food is grown to the way people eat, and the whole system through and through, all the intermediaries. Every aspect of it is essentially owned by big ag. And it's just like a big tech or big finance or whatever. Yeah, these corporations have gobbled up other corporations. Um, and, it's a joke that people talk about the free market. They're thinking supporting the current system because it's anything but free. It's like basically these monopolizing institutions that essentially set the price for everything, make sure that farmers get to be sucked into being part of the monetized economy, creating us having to sell their coffee beans or their other commoditized produce at tiny rates so that they're basically barely able to stay alive while big ag takes all the profits. And I mean, it's broken in so many different layers. The whole notion of industrial fertilizer, this kind of theory, like you say, which another myth that Big Ag puts out that this kind of stuff is necessary to feed people, whereas actually, and yeah, and I refer to other studies, detailed studies, as you said, that show that agroecology or regenerative agriculture can be every bit as or more productive when applied properly in different areas. So agroecology is a hugely important movement, which led by these groups like La Via Campesina, which is this huge. It's probably the largest single people's movement in the world today. There's hundreds of millions of peasants in South America and Sub-Saharan Africa and Southeast Asia who are part of this umbrella group of basically people who work. It's called like campesino a campesino. They work together. When they discover something that's working in their area, they'll share it with the group next to them as far as what actually works on for their particular area, for what their particular whole section of soil and needs where they are. And that basically has been shown to work. So one of the most important things we need to do is get rid of that myth. But it goes all the way through to how food is marketed and consumed. Right now, many people in the global south, many children in the global south, believe it or not, suffer from a twin ailment of malnutrition because they don't have access to healthy food and obesity because what the only thing they do have access to are these disgusting super ultra processed snacks with sugar, not even real sugar, but fake sugar anyway. But basically putting all this like really bad stuff into their bodies. And because they don't have access to nutritional food, they're hungry and they eat all this crap. And so there's a terrible, terrible epidemic of ill health going around the world that these very big ag companies have been responsible for producing. So all the way through from producing food to it being processed, packaged, and then sold. It's an absolute iconic example of recognizing that basically the system is designed from the outset for extraction and exploitation, not for the benefit of all people. And there's ways that we can change all aspects of it. So localization is a key part. Yeah, regenerative agriculture is a key part. Um, and there's also recognition that a lot of the food that people rely on are these sort of the few big grains, which is a more challenging problem because the grains themselves work through basically denuding the soil of its nutrients, and then they have to be replanted each time. So you need fertilizer. So this continual kind of treadmill that you're on. There's great ideas around perennials, for example, which have been developed by different groups, coming up with versions of wheat or rice that don't have to be replanted every year, but that can actually be planted once and then stay there, deepening their roots and being healthy for the soil, producing for many years in the future. That's received maybe like 1% or 0.1% of the investment of then other things like genetically engineered food or whatever, because it would take away from the profits of big ag. But this is what an eco-civilization is about, is recognizing these things and knowing we don't have all the answers to some of these bigger questions, but there are people who are pioneering the answers. That's what we need to be looking at and investing in.
Yeah. And again, if we cannot ship our food around the world because we don't have any oil left, I was listening to an economics podcast the other day, and farmers in India are being given 2 liters of fossil fuel something or other a day, and that's not enough to keep the water pumps going. So, so we're heading for a global food crisis, but that's going to mean people are no longer going to be able to produce food in the extractivist way that industrial agriculture wants, and they're going to be feeding themselves and their families. And with any luck at all, I just joined a seed saving group locally, and I discovered I had no idea, but the big seed companies would go into places like India and they would do a swap of we'll give you this amazing new seed that we have developed that you can get from us, we'll give it you free, provided you give us all your seed that you've been saving for generations. And then 2 years down the line, you discover that this new seed needs continual inputs, exactly as you said, and you've given away
Yeah.
all the seeds that your
Mhm.
ancestors have had
Yeah.
literally for
Yeah.
thousands of generations.
And even worse than that, the next level is so insidious. It's hard to believe that even these corporations can be so evil about it. The seeds that they then train the farmers to start using basically are patented, and
Yes.
they're not allowed to just take the new seeds that the crop
Yeah.
puts out and replant them the
No,
next
they get
year.
sued.
That
Yeah.
they'll actually get sued. They'll go to jail.
Right.
And so basically they've given away their livelihood. So the actual seeds themselves have been like have been enclosed essentially.
Mm.
It's one of the greatest producers of Commonwealth over the millennia
Yes.
is now systematically being
Being
sucked in
destroyed.
by Windigo Incorporated. Yeah.
Yes. Yes. Seed saving is a political act. People do it. Start learning how to do it. There's some really nice books. In fact, I will probably bring somebody on to talk about seed saving at some point. We're very nearly out of time, and there's so much I still wanted to talk about. But as a last thing, we're going to need laws that work and a global governance system for this. We've
Mm.
already touched
Yeah.
on that. We can't create a global financial system, then there are going to be people running off to create their network state in Greenland or whatever it is that no democracy, no death, no taxes, the little fantasy world that they live in. And we need that not to be a thing. So, what do you see as the future of a global governance system that is benign and that enables all life to flourish within a regenerating planet?
Mm. Yeah, and that's one of the most difficult questions, by the way. And I do have a chapter devoted to that, like global governance. But maybe even before we go there, let me just back up one step to look at governance itself. Because, you know, we might think of something like, well, the United Nations at least is a good thing because there's some sort of cooperation between nations. Um, but even when we look, even the very notion of democracy and our so-called leaders that we choose, that we think we're choosing democratically, it turns out that so-called electoral democracy itself is every bit as made up as the things around education or finance that we've been talking about earlier. It's not actually a democracy that we're part of. It's essentially, you can view it as an electoral oligarchy or oligarchy by consent, that basically every 4 or 5 years, people in a country get to choose. Even that itself is conditioned by the billionaire owned media, of course, but at least think they can get to choose, but not between a real leader or another one, but which oligarch, basically, which oligarchic party sets up the people who are the only ones who even trying to get elected are people who, by their nature, are the more sort of narcissistic or ego-driven or populist-oriented, even to get into that place in the first place. So it seems almost hopeless, but it's not, because what is, to me, one of the most inspiring things I've come across in all this research is this concept of deliberative democracy, which has its manifestation in what's known as citizens' assemblies. And these are groups of people chosen by sortition, basically lottery essentially, from the from the ordinary people, from the population as a whole. And if it's done properly, and if it's facilitated with care, you can have groups of people together when they get together to deliberate about an issue, and they know that what they're coming up with has impact on society as a large around them. They tend to leave behind, to jettison all these polarizing ideas that I belong to this party or I'm a racist or whatever. And they start to actually hear and respect the views of other people. And even though individually as people, we tend to be pretty lousy decision makers, we've got all these kinds of prejudices implicit that we don't even know about, that things that we bring in to come up with maybe the wrong decision. Collectively, as human beings, when we actually put our minds together and work in a way that each person's voice is heard, we come up with far wiser decisions than any kind of electoral body tends to. So citizens' assemblies have got a fantastic track record. And a big part of what I look at in the book is really rethinking what democracy actually means to be part of this kind of a grassroots, polycentric sort of notion of citizens' assemblies, essentially going from local levels all the way up to a national level. And I just wanted to get that there before I talked about global governance, because really you need that foundation to then think about what global governance would look like. Because there are very many issues that do need planetary kind of decision making, whether it's climate breakdown or the oceans or militarization or so many different things. Absolutely. But we're not going to get good decisions when we have, well, of course, right now, even the United Nations has been supplanted by the sort of power blocks of the US or Russia or China or whatever it might be. But even back to when there was a more working United Nations, that body in itself was kind of flawed in many ways by the very notion of nation states being the ones to make the decisions for people anyway. So there's actually a movement right now to create essentially a global citizens assembly at the United Nations as a separate sort of advisory body, almost like this camel's nose under the tent sort of thing, which is something I think we should all support really powerfully, because that's actually the way in which ultimately we can get good planetary governance, is by this polycentric notion of decisions being made when they can be done more locally at the local level, this concept of subsidiarity. But then when there are decisions that need like higher and higher levels of scope in order to make them properly, it has to be done through each layer choosing people to represent them at the next level up, so that ultimately you would in fact have a group of citizens themselves at that planetary level looking at what is really important based not on what one power block says, but what actually people want from around the world. We're a long way away from that. I'm not suggesting this is one of these areas where something really has to unravel before we'll put this in place. I'm not suggesting this is going to happen 5 or 10 years from now, but what I am suggesting is that the initial notions for this around citizens' assemblies, we can put our time and energy and investment in, and we are going to see this system unravel. It's terrifying. It's tragic. I don't want it. None of us who care about any kind of avoidance of suffering wants what we see happening, but it is happening. And we are going to find people asking more and more, like, we've got to reorganize the world in a different way. That's why these ideas, to that original Milton Friedman quote you were saying earlier, are so important. We need to put them in place so they're available.
Beautiful. That feels like a good place to end. I would, of course, like to ask you, what do we all need to be doing in the as the next steps? But actually, I think what people need to be doing is read your book, and then you're doing tours in the US and the UK, so people could come along and talk to you about these things. So, do you want to let us know? We will put links in the show notes of everything, but just tell us a little bit about where people can find where you're going to be in the various countries.
Sure, thank you. I'm happy to, and I'd love to see yeah, anyone who's listening into this podcast at some of these
Yes.
events when they're happening. So the book itself is coming out at the end of May. In the US, it's May 26th, and in the UK, May 28th. And basically, I'm going to be doing a few launch events here in the San Francisco Bay Area and that last week of May. The early June, I'll actually be in New York for a few days doing some events there. And then mid-June, coming to the UK, and I'll be there for until early July. And I'm glad to say I'll be doing actually a conversation with George Monbiot that's actually going to be happening at RSA in London. It's actually going to be called Yes, There Is an Alternative. And so we'll be exploring that together. I'm honored to be able to talk with George there. But also, there'll be different events in Bristol and Bath, other events in London, an event in most likely in Oxford, and probably one in Cambridge. And some of them will be with other people whose work has inspired my own, such as Luke Kemp, who's written that great book, Goliath's Curse, we're hoping. Jonathan Porritt, who's been an
Yay.
incredible thinker for decades, will be probably talking with me in Bristol. So there'll be a
Fantastic.
lot of events that'll be really exciting and conversation with real leading thinkers. Um, and so yeah, I'll share some of those with you for
Yeah,
the
please do. Yes. Is there one going to be an events page on your website or something so that people can go and just see where they
yes,
all
there
are?
will be also,
Okay,
yes.
we'll put
So
that in the
we
show
can link to
notes.
that too, yeah.
And
Cool.
we will put links to where people can get your book because absolutely people, if you're interested in a utopian future, then this is the book to read because it's so well researched. I know I said that in the last podcast, but honestly, the depth and breadth of your research is amazing and your intellectual capacity to hold all these ideas and bring them into a coherent model is
Mm.
fantastic. This is the theory of change that we need to be running with. And we can
Yeah,
tweak it slightly as things emerge. But if we could bring this into wider awareness, then I think the world would change really
yeah.
quite fast.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for that, Amanda. And the one thing I'd add to what you just said is, um, I do want to emphasize that that the book, while it does look at all these different possible futures and show what's possible, it is not a blueprint. It's not
That's true.
like
Yeah.
me looking at all these great thinkers and saying this is how it's going to
No,
work.
no.
More than anything, it's like I want it to be a conversation starter. It does set a framework. There are core principles that we all need to agree on about setting those conditions for thriving, etc. But from that, there's all kinds of interpretations, all kinds of different cultures and different
Mm.
groups that might interpret things in different ways. So let's think of this more as a conversation starter, where almost like setting an ecosystem for change. That then people can come into it and say, actually, I kind of prefer this. I focus on that. But then we're
Yeah.
all working together to create that diversified, really a pluriversal future, rather than suggesting that there's a
Yes, there's a
future that is
monolithic. No, I
available to
didn't.
us. It's the right one.
Absolutely.
So I
Yes,
just
the
wanted to
future will
emphasize
be
that for, yeah.
multifaceted for sure. Thank you. Brilliant. I look forward to talking to you again sometime when we find out how the book has landed and maybe can look at some of the changes already being made. But in the
Mm.
meantime, thank you for coming on to the Accidental Gods podcast.
Thank you so much, Amanda. It's been great talking with you as always.